Good evening. And welcome. I am Kelly Sims Gallagher. I'm the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and non-resident scholar right here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Tonight's event occurs amid ongoing debate about the boundaries between military and civilian security roles in the United States. Americans are observing a dramatic expansion in the visible presence of federal officers, some of whom are clad in masks and tactical military gear similar to that used by military forces on foreign battlefields. In addition, military reservists and National Guard personnel have been deployed domestically, raising questions about the legal authorities being used for these deployments. Questions such as how the military responds to political polarization, how civilian authority is upheld, and what lessons can be drawn from other democracies will be explored during our conversation this evening. But rather than presuming a breakdown in civil-military relations, this moment invites careful analysis of whether existing legal authorities, institutional practices, and professional norms are functioning as intended, and how public trust may shape or be shaped by these choices. We also gather tonight in honor of the late Professor Richard Shultz, the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor of International Security Studies at the Fletcher School. Professor Shultz was a transformative educator and mentor, known for his demanding yet deeply humane teaching style, his unwavering support for students, and his extraordinary service to our International Security Studies program. Over 42 years on the faculty at Fletcher, he shaped the professional trajectories of more than 6,000 students, not counting those he taught before coming to Fletcher and during sabbaticals at West Point, the U.S. Naval College, and the Marine Corps University. Most recently, and the inspiration for tonight's event, he revitalized the study of civil-military relations at Fletcher, including reintroducing our course on the subject this past fall. So it's fitting that this event honors the legacy of someone who educated generations of defense and military professionals. He cared deeply about the role of force in global affairs. In fact, his most legendary class was called The Role of Force. And tonight, we're fortunate to have Fletcher's own Daniel Dresner guiding tonight's discussion. Professor Dresner serves as the academic dean and distinguished professor of international politics at the Fletcher School. He brings deep expertise on global politics, institutions, and U.S. foreign policy, and he will lead us through a rich exploration, I am sure, of the challenges and opportunities confronting civil-military relations today. We have a fantastic, truly exceptional panel. Starting to Dan's right, Saskia Breckenmacher is a Fletcher alumna and senior fellow in Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. And she brings extensive experience analyzing democratic backsliding, civil society, and political institutions with a comparative perspective. Corey Shockey, at the end, is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the country's leading voices on defense strategy, civil-military relations, and American national security, and she has a new book out on civil-military relations, which is the #1 book in political science right now, which is awesome. And Elliot Cohen is the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Cohen's a distinguished scholar of military strategy, civil-military dynamics, and national security decision-making. So you can see, together this panel brings a breadth of scholarly, policy, and practical expertise that will help us better understand the evolving landscape of U.S. civil-military relations. Thank you once again to our hosts at Carnegie, to our moderator and panelists, and to all of you for joining us. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Daniel Dresner.
Thank you very much, Dean Gallagher. I am pleased to be the least qualified person on this stage to talk about civil-military relations. Indeed, because I'm the least qualified, I'm not really going to say that much, except to note that if you think about the history of civil-military relations in the United States, it is interesting how the concerns have waxed and waned over the years. As Corey mentioned back in the green room, if you take a look at the Federalist Papers, there was deep concern within the Federalist Papers about the idea of a Praetorian military exercising undue influence over an extremely nascent democracy. By the time we get to Huntington's The Soldier and the State, on the other hand, that concern was not in that book, as Corey noted. And if we think about 21st century, I remember reading, concerns that had been voiced by both Eliot and Corey about, let's say, the role that generals played in terms of making political endorsements, retired generals to be sure, but still, nonetheless, the question of the norm of a professional military wading into politics and what did that mean in the long term. And I remember thinking, well, is that really that big of a concern? As I said, I was the least qualified person to be on this panel. Because in retrospect, I think the concern has mounted. And just in the last year, we have, the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of War, depending on your preference, firing or removing the top members of the JAG Corps, of the Air Force and the Army. We have the Southcom commander resigning over what was reported to be a disagreement over the legality of the use of force in the Caribbean. And we have a civilian leadership that really does seem to want to transform the ethos of the military in ways, that one could view as sort of going back rather than going forwards. So I can't think of any better group of people to talk about this. Corey, I'm going to start with you. The current administration seems, let's say, eager to use or deploy the U.S. military within our borders for legally questionable actions. This leads to an obvious question, one that was debated throughout 2024, particularly after President Trump got elected. Should we expect U.S. officers to follow illegal orders?
No, you should not expect American military officers to obey illegal orders. But I would add two really strong caveats. The first is that if we get to the point where the military choosing whether or not to obey orders, the system has already failed. Mm-hmm. And I notice in the discussion about the boat strikes in the Caribbean, our public discourse very quickly telescoped down to, should the commander have followed this order? Nobody was saying, why did the President of the United States issue this order? Why did Congress not demand the right to veto this? Why did the Secretary of Defense transmit this order? Where's the National Security Advisor in this? We are putting the burden of systemic upkeep on the military themselves, and that is an unfair burden to place upon them. We should be focusing it at the higher civilian levels because that's where the problem resides. And the second thing I would say about illegal orders is that it's clearly true that every commander has a lawyer at her or his elbow, but how many of you know lawyers, right? We are assuming that the legal advice they get is yes or no, black or white, and it tends instead to be, I have 3 potential concerns you might want to weigh as you make your decision. So it's not often black and white. Second of all, no legal judgment removes from the commander the responsibility for the decision, right? So they still have to make an operational decision. And the judge advocate general gets trumped by the secretary's civilian lawyer, who gets trumped by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department. And in order to fail to obey an order, you are going to get court-martialed, and the burden of proof in a court-martial is on the service member to demonstrate that the order was illegal. The burden of proof is not on the civilian leadership. That's why I think we really need to back the system up and confront the civilians, not telescope down to, should the military be doing this, or are they going to save the republic for us when we're not holding the civilians accountable?
That's a great point. Eliot, let's pivot to a slightly different question. In some ways, the core of the U.S. civil-military relation is the premise that we believe there's such a thing as objective military advice, that there's a professional military, the whole idea of professionalism. And we like to believe that presidents should get objective military advice. Do presidents usually get professional military advice? Do they get objective military advice? Or are there biases, are there ways in which you have to think the military is skewed? And also, as a follow-up, do you think this administration is different in terms of the advice they're demanding in some cases?
So, I mean, the immediate question is, of course not, or at least that's the immediate answer. Before I go into why that's the case, though, I want to thank Dean Gallagher for the introduction and for smoothing over the fact that I spent 34 years as a professor at SAIS and as dean. Having put that on the table, I hope to get out of this room in one piece. I also want to say something about Dick Shultz, because I knew him very well for a very, very long time. In many ways, I thought of him as a model when I came to SAIS quite a long time ago. And I'll just say that we're in an era, professors should be judged by what they write and how they teach. And unfortunately, I think increasingly they tend to be judged by what they write and above all, how much they write and where they publish. But to me, the marker of a great professor is the quality of their teaching, because that's what lasts. All the people that they touch, those 6,000 graduates that you referred to, and I've known many, many of Dick's students, and they all talk about him the same way. So just a tribute to Dick, and I miss him. So the answer to your question is no. And the reason why the answer to your question is no is because there's a difference between professionalism, which we've got, and the idea of objective advice, which doesn't really exist. And to go further, there are two particular reasons why you can't get something called objective military advice. First, and this is something that their subordinates know very well, general and flag officers are human beings. They have biases, they have antipathies, they have rivalries, they have all the quirks of human nature. And they in particular, know that they have the lives of other people in their hands, and so they have strong views, and they have strong views of politicians who don't come from the same walk of life that they do. So if you want evidence of that, look at Colin Powell's memoirs, which is just seething with contempt for most of his civilian counterparts. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear, say in the run-up to the Gulf War, Powell did not expect the president, when he goes into the president and says, I think we're going to have to, if you really want a military option, you're going to have to double the forces we have there. And much to his surprise, the president says, okay, which is not what he expected. I think he was doing a very standard military thing. Well, sir, we can do that, but, and I think Bush, I don't know whether Bush thought he was calling his bluff, but in effect he did. And in any case, those the personality traits of people at the very top matter. But the second thing I would say is that there's something problematic about the very idea of objective military advice. I don't think such a thing exists for a whole bunch of reasons. First, by and large, officers grow up, not by and large, officers grow up in different tribes. Fighter pilots, submariners, light infantrymen. And they come away with very distinctive views of what war is, what authority is, what command is, what is achievable, what's not achievable. And even within those, they may have very different kinds of expertise. So, large-scale armored warfare along what used to be the inter-German border against the Soviets is one thing, counterinsurgency is another. A very good illustration of this is when Secretary Gates relieved David McKiernan, our commander in Afghanistan, who was very much a heavy Army general officer. Probably would have been terrific if we had gone toe-to-toe with the Russians in a big conventional war, but was not suited actually for a counterinsurgency campaign. Or when you have say an admiral as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the idea that they have objective expertise about counterinsurgency, which after all does take place on land, is a stretch. That leads to a third point, which is because of the system that we have, and that most countries have, the president has a senior military advisor. That is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In theory, he or she can turn to the other chiefs, and in fact, in practice, the president can turn to whoever they want to turn for military advice. But that's actually very difficult to do. And the pushback is very, very intense. So it would be as if you could only get medical advice funneled through your doctor, unless you really were willing to alienate that doctor, even though they might not be an orthopedist or an oncologist or whatever it is that you needed. So for this, and I think for other reasons, the norm, as I've argued in some of my writings, should be for the presidents to interrogate, to question, to grub around in the important details, because there is no such thing. There's professionalism, but there isn't objective military advice. And I would say that presidents have always been this way. You know, there's a very famous message that Lincoln sends to, it's a letter I think he sends to Grant before they go off he goes off in 1864, says, you know, I completely trust you. I don't need to know your plans. You know, just go forth, bring us victory. You know, you are the general. I finally found the guy that I need to win the Civil War. And not surprisingly, generals swoon when they read that, because that's the kind of letter they would all like to get. And what they forget is what Lincoln immediately does is he attaches Richard Dana, who is the Assistant Secretary of War, to Grant's headquarters with a cipher, the key to which only the Secretary of War had, and Lincoln, so that he could report back regularly on everything that Grant was doing, which meant that there was not complete trust, and you'd be crazy to have complete trust. To the question of this president, again, I think the answer is we don't know. You'd have to ask somebody like General Kurilla, the former CENTCOM commander, who was there earlier on, or General Kane, who sure as heck is not going to talk. If I had to guess, I would guess, along with Corey, that on anything that is legal, when the president says, I want an option to take out Maduro, they'll say, by golly, we'll come out with the best possible option to snatch Maduro, and they'll go ahead and do it. I think the one area the one case where I wonder is about Greenland. I'd be really interested to know what the advice was on Greenland. And if I had to guess, because the military, again, is very good at this, they would have said something like, sir, absolutely we can do it, but you know, the Danes are actually a little bit tougher than you may think. They took more casualties per capita than we did in Afghanistan. They know that terrain. We can do it, sir, but we may take 100 casualties, maybe 200, and maybe lose, you know, a couple of cargo planes and stuff like that, knowing that Trump would not have the stomach for that. I would not be at all surprised. This is part of, and with this I'm going to stop, part of a phenomenon that our friend and colleague Peter Feaver calls shirking. That's a somewhat harsh word, but I think it's typical of any bureaucracy. And you know, for an elaboration of this, all you have to do is watch past episodes of Yes, Minister, and you know, you'll see it playing out in the British setting.
Saskia, I want to turn to you, and in some ways I want to follow on something that Corey said, which is basically the very idea that we're asking whether the military will follow illegal orders sort of reduces the question to the last possible decision node, and really it's why would a president give such orders? And you know, there's some concern in some parts that the U.S. is currently engaging in sort of de-democratization. There was that chart that I think John Byrne Murdoch at the Financial Times posted about the degree of democratic deconsolidation in the United States over the last year, and it's moving real quick. A lot of democracy analysts argued previously that essentially the professionalism of the U.S. military was a key constraint on democratic deconsolidation. In other words, there'd be no circumstance under which the president would be able to rely on the military to stay in power illegally or to engage in extra-legal actions or engage in just, frankly, authoritarian power consolidation. I guess my question to you is, has this changed? Mm-hmm. And given what we've seen in other countries, I mean, I think one of the other things to realize over the last 10 years is the assumption that the U.S. is somehow exceptional in terms of what's going on. Actually, what's going on in the United States is clearly going on in a lot of other countries. What should we be watching in terms of civil-military relations as an indicator of democratic resilience or democratic fragility?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Dan. And first of all, it's such a pleasure to be at a Fletcher event. And I have to admit, I'm a bit intimidated to be here with two experts on civil military relations,
Don't be.
which I am
Don't
not. My research is very much on the democracy side of this, so I'll speak to that part. I guess I would start with a broader point, which is that I think when we look at democratic erosion, it's useful to zoom out a little bit and not look at civil military relations per se, but at security sector governance or governance of the security forces. Because usually what happens, or what we've seen in other cases of democratic erosion, the military often plays an important role, not always, but it's usually the whole security sector that is impacted. So that includes police forces, intelligence, paramilitary forces, right? Prosecution authorities, et cetera. So it's useful to have that broader lens and see the military as one actor in that broader sector. The second point I would make is that what we're seeing, or to first talk about the comparative side of it, what we've seen in recent years, there are obviously cases of democratic erosion where it's actually the military that's breaking down democracy, right, through coup d'etats. That's not really the pattern that's most common anymore, right? We're seeing this gradual erosion through elected, to some degree, popular leaders who come to power legitimately and then take steps to consolidate power. And often, particularly in these kind of authoritarian populist cases, what we're seeing is that they're coming to power by making an argument that they're actually going against, right, a political, social, and bureaucratic elite that they deem undemocratic. And we are the democratically elected force here, and we have to sort of take back power from that undemocratic elite. And the security sector is often part of that bureaucratic elite that's being targeted. So I think it's really important to pay attention to what's happening to the security sector. I think there are a few patterns I would highlight that we've seen across multiple cases. So I'll briefly walk through those and then talk about what I see happening in the US and how that fits those patterns. One is obviously personnel changes. So you will see purges, or to a lower degree, you'll see changes where the normal meritocratic path of promotion, advancement is disrupted, and you see kind of more efforts to place loyalists in positions of power and eliminate those who are more likely to be problems. Weakening of accountability and oversight mechanisms is another one. A third one, which I think is quite important, is just a general pattern of securitization and use of emergency powers, so that you define an ever larger set of domestic problems as security problems, as national security problems. You define an ever larger set of domestic actors as security threats, which then in turn enables you to do more aggressive policing, but in some cases also authorizes or justifies deployment of military actors domestically. And then the fourth one I would highlight is fractionalization of the security sector, and sometimes sort of the creation of parallel structures. So in some places, that's because governments are worried about coups, right? So they engage in coup proofing by creating sort of overlapping security structures. But in some cases, it can also be because they don't actually trust the military all that much, or they actually know the military has professional norms, and so they create other forces that are seen as more loyal and more dependent on the executive branch. So given all of that, where is the US? As Dan mentioned, I think there are some things that are making maybe the US security sector, in particular the military, less vulnerable to some of these pressures, right? There's a long tradition of professionalism, nonpartisanship. There are institutional legal safeguards, constitutional safeguards. I think the federal system is also an interesting one, which we can maybe talk about more. That being said, if I look through the categories I just outlined, there are obviously lots of signs of concern. So there have been personnel changes, and we've already mentioned those at highest levels. And I think there's a real risk here that as a result, that also changes perceptions of the military. If you're seeing people being put into place that don't seem to be there because of meritocratic reasons. We're seeing some weakening of oversight mechanisms, whether that's kind of blocking Congress and exercising its normal oversight powers, but also firing of lawyers or moving some of the military lawyers to work on immigration cases, et cetera. States of emergency and domestic deployments, I think that's a very clear pattern that we're seeing the Trump administration use the language of emergency to deal with issues like immigration, crime, protest in some cases, right, and frame those as national security issues rather than general normal law enforcement challenges, right, that the police would generally be responsible for. And then obviously we've seen the deployment of National Guard troops or attempted deployments. The courts have pushed back in some cases. So I think that's certainly, to me, a worrisome sign. And then with the fractionalization issue, I would highlight sort of the emergence of DHS and ICE in particular as a very powerful federal law enforcement entity over the past year as a worrisome trend.
It's now the largest, I believe, correct?
It is the largest now. The budget has, increased dramatically. We've seen the number of ICE officers, I think, has more than doubled over the past year. There have been lots of reports about how training has been accelerated. There's not sufficient training. It's definitely not comparable to what an FBI agent would receive. And then there's just generally the concern that the professional standards are lower and the norms are different than, say, in the military. And so the emergence of this sort of alternative powerful force and then the gradual expansion of the realm in which that force is deployed, which obviously right now is immigration enforcement, but already we're seeing signs where, okay, it's also the people protesting immigration enforcement that are now framed as sort of the problem. So and then there's surveillance powers that are being expanded and are also targeting people who are not just immigrants, but also those who are opposing the immigration policy. So there's an expansion of the domain for which that agency is responsible. So maybe I'll stop here, but I think to me those are some of the signs of concern.
One of the perks of being moderator is before I'm going to go to all of you for questions, I get to ask a couple of questions based on what I heard. One question I actually have, following up on Saskia, is, and Corey, you mentioned this as well, is what is the proper role of Congress in all of this? Because I think one of the tells, and this long precedes Trump, has been, frankly, the atrophying of congressional oversight on not just defense matters, but frankly, all of foreign policy. I co-authored a paper with Linda Fowler looking at sort of the degree to which Congress engages in actual oversight hearings, and there's been a persistent decline, in part because members of Congress are less incentivized to take an interest in this, because it doesn't necessarily get them elected or reelected. But I guess my question is there a role that Congress can play in correcting any concerns or incipient worries that there might be about civil-military relations?
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
I mean, the destabilization of the American political system is the result of Congress failing to carry out its Article I responsibilities. It's not a separate and equal branch of government. It's designed to be the central branch of government. And so, I mean, Alexander Hamilton would be thrilled to see that the executive has amassed enough power to take the country to war without an authorization for the use of military force from Congress. I'm quite starchy about that, and I think everybody should be. So who they confirm into senior civilian and military positions is a hugely important part of oversight. And I feel like everybody who voted for Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel ought to have to answer for that for the rest of their professional lives, because those people are doing genuine damage to the security and eventually prosperity of our country.
Elliot or Saskia, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think you're right, and Corey is right to say this is a problem of very long standing. I mean, the executive branch has been getting away with not asking for authorizations for the use of military force for some time, although I would point out, actually it was worse in the Obama and Biden administrations, which did not ask for AUMFs when they were, for example, going to war in Libya. The much maligned George W. Bush did get AUMFs for Iraq and Afghanistan. I also think there's a secular trend here on foreign policy. During the Cold War, this was national security policy, foreign policy was a high issue, and senators and representatives wanted to somehow be engaged in it. It was felt to be a matter of life and death, and I think some of this is just a natural consequence of the declining salience of these things. That's not an excuse, and it's particularly not an excuse for, I completely agree with Corey, letting people like Pete Hegseth become Secretary of Defense. He is Secretary of Defense. He doesn't get to change the name of the department. Congress gets to do that. But I think it's important for all of us as we look at this, and it is so easy to get alarmed about this administration, and I periodically indulge in that myself, that we don't look at the deeper roots of some of the phenomena that are disturbing us.
Congress hasn't passed a budget on time. in 11 of the last 13 years. And the accession by the committees to allow omnibus legislation instead of the 14 individual bills is an abrogation of their constitutional authority.
Yeah, Saskia.
Yeah, just to add to that, I also think what we've seen over the past year is even in areas where there are legislative safeguards, the legislation isn't foolproof. So I would point to the Insurrection Act, right? For example, that's been identified as a risk that could be invoked. You know, Congress could change the Insurrection Act. A lot of terms are not properly defined, and I think that's what we've seen across a range of laws, that they've been passed, but there's vast uncertainty about how they could be interpreted. And so I think that's also an area where I see Congress as having failed its responsibility.
It's a great point.
Another check in theory is the sort of judiciary, the courts, even the military courts. And I'll give an example of this, which was, we've learned over the past week that apparently the DC attorney tried to get indictments of the 6 former service members in Congress who put out a video saying, hey, military, don't follow illegal orders. And the indictments failed, which, and in fact, I believe they actually failed to get a single grand juror to vote in favor of the indictment, which is just a stunning rebuke of that kind of prosecutorial overreach. And it is not an isolated case. There have been many cases now where grand juries have refused to indict when prosecutors have tried to go for things. Corey, you mentioned that now there are 2 ways of looking at this. One way to look at it is that this is actually an example of a check on, a president exceeding their authority or weaponizing the criminal system in order to be able to get what they want, both in terms of the military and in terms of prosecuting Congress. But the other way to look at it is the very fact that he tried to do this can have a chilling effect on others who are afraid that they might then be the next target. I mean, how should we view this?
Yeah, we should view it with great concern. The politicization of the coercive arms of the state is a great danger in a free society. And the president is enthusiastically politicizing the Justice Department. And I would also say, is attempting to overwhelm the justice system with the sheer number of challenges that they are bringing. But 2 pieces of good news. First, it's not the reaction of the people targeted actually really matters when norms and institutions are challenged in free societies. And, all 6 of those members of Congress were like, I'm here, go ahead. You know where to find me. And the examples of refusing to be intimidated also really matter. The second thing is those examples also affect how judges weigh cases. And the Supreme Court decision in Illinois versus Trump, I think, is incredibly important because 6-3, the High Court determined that President Trump lacked either a constitutional or statutory basis for the deployment of National Guard in California, Oregon, and Illinois. Those have been withdrawn, and for people who worry about election integrity, governors now own their National Guard to be able to protect the state's practices of carrying out federal elections.
Corey, hold on, I want to follow up, quickly. One thing about Corey. You mentioned being tried in military courts, how the preponderance of evidence suddenly shifts and it's the defendant who has to prove their innocence. Do you think this is another case where juries there might actually, make it harder to prosecute someone for failing to follow an order?
So the Uniform Code of Military Justice, to court-martial Senator Kelly, for example, the only way a court-martial is appropriate is if you are adjudicating anything he had done while on active duty. So the UCMJ cannot be applied to activities that didn't happen on active duty.
Sorry.
I would just add to all this. I mean, there's another. First, I think actually the courts have been quite remarkable, but the nature of our federal system, I think, is really has been really important in ways that Corey said. We have another safeguard, which is that by and large these people are knuckleheads.
These people are not what?
By and large, these people are knuckleheads.
Oh.
They are not deploying battalions of highly competent lawyers. They are deploying at most squads of very incompetent lawyers who don't have experience in these kinds of prosecutions, which is why they end up looking like idiots, and the cases get thrown out with the tongue lashing from the judge. And I think they've also, what you've also seen is they've actually been backing down on a whole bunch of things. And even where they are doing things like purges, which are like, it was terrible to fire the General C.Q. Brown and a bunch of other people. But Pete Hegseth is not organized enough to do a careful purge of the senior ranks of the General Officer Corps so he can promote the colonels who he has carefully identified as MAGA trolls. Instead, it's very petty. You work for Mark Milley, so you must be a bad guy, and I'm going to try to force you out of the military, which is wrong and unfair and dangerous. But
Just incredibly petty.
But it's incredibly petty. But they're just not systematic enough to be, Benito Mussolini.
Let me, look, one of my jobs as a professor is occasionally to sort of play devil's advocate. And let me suggest that, the concerns about a professional military and apolitical military ignore politics. That, my colleague Elizabeth Saunders, for example, wrote a great book called The Insider's Game about the fact that advisors to presidents, including, the General Officer Corps, play a political role. And that in some ways, presidents need their support if they are going to take some sort of action or choose not to take some sort of action. So much as political scientists like to point out, of course, Supreme Court justices are political actors. Are we naive when we talk about civil-military relations to sort of deny the fact that, of course, the military is a political actor?
So I would make a distinction between political and partisan, because any leader of an institution is a politician. You have vision, you make resourcing decisions.
I just recently became academic dean, so this is something I'm learning the hard way. Keep going.
And there's the example of Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who was the chief of the Navy during the Vietnam War. And when he promoted the first female admiral in the Navy, in I think it was 1973, as he put her epaulets on her shoulder, he tells the story saying that he received more hate mail about that act than anything else he did as the chief of the Navy. And he responded to those objections by saying, "You have no idea how many cheeks I had to kiss to become the chief of naval operations. And this is the first time it was a pleasure." Right? Like, these are political positions, but that's different. As all of us learned from Eliot's outstanding scholarship, you need military leaders who understand the political constraints that a president's operating under. Otherwise, they cannot produce effective responses to political requests. But if they are partisan, then that makes them compromised.
I think you cannot survive in those, and you can't be useful if in those kinds of positions if you're not politically literate. That is not the same thing as being partisan. And I also think that most of these people wrestle with their obligations and their sense of the military profession on the one hand, with their relationship with their superiors. And and I think they most, by and large, the large majority of them in the United States at any rate, try to maintain that professional ethos. But I think it's an internal struggle for them. The thing is that the people they consult about it are other four-stars. They don't talk to the likes of us.
Although you could,
that's not entirely.
I would say that I'm going to push back on that. That's not entirely accurate. One of the hallmarks of the U.S. military is the professional military education system, including, among others, since we're doing this in honor of Dick Shultz, the fact that we have a lot of officers that go through places like Fletcher, places like elsewhere.
That's true, and I've taught some of those people, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But when they're really in a crunch, the chairman is highly unlikely. It can happen, and it has happened, but they're more likely to call one of their predecessors who they respect, who they can completely count on to be discreet, to say, "Look, I just got asked to do this, that, and the other thing. How do you think I ought to handle it?" They are very unlikely to call a professor. Which is prudent and wise.
I think so. Okay, I think we're now at the point where we are going to ask questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. And also for those of you who are live streaming, I believe you can submit questions that way, and I will have my trusty iPad to do that. The gentleman over here was the first one to get his hand up. Yep, just wait, the mic's coming.
Thank you so much. This extremely insightful discussion, which is exactly the same type of learning experience I had at Fletcher quite a while ago. And my question...
That check will be in the mail, sir.
Oh, yeah. So my name is Nawatsu Aoyama, a Washington-based diplomatic correspondent with the Asahi Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. And my question is, sorry. So this is really an interesting dynamics going on here. So he's sorry. Sorry. Given the anarchical nature of the international society, it seems like President Trump has seemed to face fewer and lower hurdles in the international arena than within the United States. And so the sequence seems like this. So he tries to... So the guiding principle that I don't need international law or his attempt to bend the U.S. military to his will are first applied in the international arena as he did in Venezuela, and then is applied in the U.S. Like the administration did in Minneapolis, and maybe is projected further into the international society. Which he may try to do in the Middle East, well beyond the Western Hemisphere now. So, what do you think about this seemingly dangerous, cyclical, escalating dynamics between the U.S. and the international society?
I mean, it's interesting to think. I mean, I recall Trump back in, like, I want to say 2011, tweeted something to the effect that he was convinced Obama was going to declare war on Iran as a way to try to get reelected, which seems interesting to bring up nowadays. You know, I'll throw it to any of you. Elliot?
Yeah, so let me preface my remarks by saying I have as good a record on being critical of Donald Trump as anybody on the planet going back 10 years. And I can give you the articles to prove it. Having said that, I think his use overseas has actually been pretty good. I think, you know, they pounded the Houthis for a while, and the Houthis pretty much stopped attacking American ships. Has the problem been entirely resolved? No, it has not. Spending a day dropping very heavy bombs on the Iranian nuclear program, it didn't obliterate it, as he said, but it unquestionably set it back a good while. I think that's okay. Am I unhappy that Nicolas Maduro is in American custody? Unhappy about it? Not particularly. And more importantly, it's pretty clear, and there's been polling on this, Venezuelan people are not unhappy about this at all. And actually, in some ways, I think this is going to end up being pretty good for Venezuela. Now, what they may be about to do in Iran, I think, is a different matter, because it's not clear to me what their strategic objectives would be if they did do it. But the point is that their uses of force overseas have been actually quite measured, and on the whole, effective, which you can't say about every administration, including the one that Corey and I served in. I also think that, as always with things Trump, you have to, the rhetoric is very important. The things they say are disturbing, yes, but you also have to look at the actions. Have they invoked the Insurrection Act? No, they have not. Have they pulled the National Guard off of American streets? Actually, yes, they have. Have they indulged in, mass purges of the American military? No, they have not. Is there garden variety, and sometimes not just garden variety corruption? Yeah. And are there a lot of bad things? Yeah. But I think it's, as we go forward, because we have 3 more years of this, it's just very, very important to say, to look at what actually is happening and form at least part of our judgments on that and not just on the things they say.
Yeah, Saskia.
I would add, I think the two realms are somewhat different, right? The US president has different powers in foreign policy than other areas of policy. I would also say part of the reason some of the things have happened that you just correctly outlined, there's been a lot of domestic pushback, right? So we have veto players at the domestic level that have proven, in some areas at least, effective. Courts that have pushed back against deployment of National Guard troops. There's been mass protest, right? And changes in public opinion that I do think have pushed Congress now to act on some of these issues with respect to ICE. So it's not that there's been restraint on the side of the administration, but there's been significant sources of pushback. And I think when we look at the international level, that looks decidedly different, right? Because there are bigger powers, and you do see pushback as well. And there, the administration has changed its tone a little bit on Greenland, for example. But I think it is just a fundamentally different realm.
Okay, I see students there. I'm going to go with right over there. Yep, you. But you need to wait for the mic. That's important.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Isabella. I'm a first year at Fletcher in the MALD program. I wanted to go
loving
back.
it.
I love it, yes. I wanted to go back to the point on the role of state governments. I'm from the state of Maryland. Our governor is Wes Moore, who has a long career in the U.S. Army and has made a point of many of his recent positioning to combat the current administration on its use of the National Guard. And we're seeing this being a trend with Governor Gavin Newsom, also Governor Tim Walz, where you really have state governments at the forefront of this fight. And interestingly enough, where we have a Republican president right now kind of pushing for big government versus small government, and states are kind of asking for that power back. So I was wondering what your thoughts were in terms of this evolving role, I would say, of, at least in modern history, of governors and their role in protecting democracy, and also relations with their military, particularly National Guard and reserves. I believe Tim Walz made a really strong point of trying to ensure that it wasn't a point of tension. And I think that that's interesting going forward, as governors are going to probably continuously be in positions of needing to maintain strong relations while also protecting their population.
Saskia, do you want to handle this?
I think Corey might be able to speak to this too, but I guess one thing I would note, I agree with you, and I think what is so interesting about this, it does feel like a change from the state-federal relationship historically in the U.S., where you had a long history of what some political scientists have called subnational autocracy in the U.S., right? Where even as the state nationally was a democracy, that was not true for all pockets of the country. And you had the federal government using its powers vis-a-vis the state to try and enforce civil rights legislation, for example, using the National Guard in some instances. So now we have this turnaround, right, where the authoritarian tendencies are coming from federal government, and you see states pushing back against that. You also see now the federal government using some of those civil rights laws and regulations to actually push back against the states. So it's a really interesting turnaround, I think. Yeah, inversion of what we've seen historically. I guess my instinct would be that it's not clear where this will go, but I would expect that just we'll see this sort of back and forth continue over the next few years, because as we've seen, the states, at least those currently controlled by the Democratic Party opposition, coordinating more and more, right, and coordinating quite effectively with each other and sharing lessons. And so I expect that pushback will continue, and so it might be a bit of a what's the expression?
Tug of war.
Tug of war in the coming years, and we'll also then, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves in terms of them using some of these laws that historically were meant to protect, for example, vulnerable minorities in the United States, but are now being turned around actually to go against the states. I'm not sure if any of you want to add to that.
Sure. So I think it's important to remember that you don't get the Constitution of the United States ratified without the Second Amendment, which is that governors will have well-regulated militia in order to protect the state from the federal government, right? So it's not news that governors are an important counterbalance. So my favorite description of the American government actually started out as a description of the United States Navy. It's in Herman Wouk's wonderful novel, The Caine Mutiny. And he describes the United States Navy as having been designed by geniuses to be run by idiots. And I feel the same thing is true of the American political system. I mean, federalism is the saving grace of the American political system, and it's also really important in civil-military relations, right? Because you don't have a central locale that can be captured. How would you even imagine taking over the United States government when states have their own military forces, where power's distributed in a cultural center in, some may say Boston, some may say Palo Alto, that you have the commercial capital in New York City, that you have the media capital in Atlanta and Los Angeles. The distribution of power and the governor's role in that really matters for keeping this country safe.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I don't know of any other country that has a system like ours, where you have the National Guard. Now, I mean, at this point, it is sort of like a part-time military, but there are two sort of part-time militaries. There's the Reserve and there's the National Guard, and governors have the so-called tags, the Adjutant General. They have their own senior military advisor, and they have some control, not complete control, and less than they used to, over what are essentially army units in their own states. The other element of this, which I think has been a very helpful break, is like when we had National Guardsmen on the streets of Washington, D.C. These are locals. So the chances that they brought in some from, I think, West Virginia, but by and large, that is a very big difference in dealing with the local population. If these are, people who are, in many cases, neighbors. So it's a great thing. I will just say one last thing. When I was studying with Sam Huntington, who was much better than Corey thinks.
It's not better than Corey thinks.
The standard belief was, it's anachronistic to have the National Guard. It's inefficient. You should have a single, national military reserve the way other countries do. And once again, I think it shows that there was a kind of wisdom in the way the country was put together that we benefit from.
We have a question from the live stream that I think is interesting. Democratic institutions often recover from periods of strain only to find that subtle but lasting damage has been done to norms and expectations. What would success look like for U.S. civil-military relations over the next decade, and how would we know if we'd achieved it versus simply survived?
May I take that one?
Yep, go ahead.
So the norms that guide American civil-military relations go back to the founding. 13 of the 85 Federalist Papers are about the concern of having a standing army and the threat it poses to democracy. So much of the debate about civil-military relations derives from the fact that we had the great good fortune to have George Washington setting an example while norms gelled and while the institutions of the American government sunk roots. But after Washington, you get a whole bunch of bad examples of these charismatic military leaders who think they're smarter than the civilians, right? My favorite example is that anybody care to guess the first American president to fire military leaders for their perceived political leanings?
John Adams.
Thomas Jefferson. Close, Dan, very close, right? He cashiers all of Washington's young Federalists and puts in place General James Wilkinson, of whom it was said he never won a battle or lost a court-martial. He was a Spanish agent the entire 12 years he led the American military. So politicians have been politicizing the military forever. And in the post-1973 era, the military is so much more popular than the institutions of government are that politicians are going to hide behind the military for as long as they're more popular than the politicians, by which I mean to say forever. But the norms and the institutions really are holding. And I think you saw it even just this week, right? Where the president went to one of the B forts, Benning or Bragg, I can't remember which, and gave a very strident, norm-shattering political election speech in front of a military audience. He actually said, "You need to vote for me," to them. And you know what happened? Nothing. They sat there in stoic silence, not participating in the politicization. And these were 19-year-olds. These weren't the 4 stars. So I think you should actually have an enormous amount of confidence in the level of professionalization and the strength of the norms in the institution. But that doesn't excuse the pressure that the politicians are putting on the military. I think it hasn't been this severe since at least the constitutional crisis of 1867.
Saskia?
And just to add one thought, I very much agree with it, but I also think looking comparatively, we see that there are very few cases of actual democratic recovery. So once you're on a pathway of erosion, it's very difficult to get back. And we're seeing that even in some more recent cases that we've been treating as sort of success cases, like see Brazil, see Poland, where electorates successfully voted authoritarian-leaning leaders out of power. Those movements aren't gone, and they, in both countries, are there's a real likelihood they will come back. Mm-hmm. So I think, just in terms of the more pessimistic perspective, I very much agree with what you said about the military. I'm worried that once you've consolidated or expanded executive powers, that's really difficult to reverse. And we've already seen that in the US post 9/11, right? The expansion of executive power, that didn't go away. And the same thing, what's happening now, the type of expansion of executive power we're seeing, I would expect that to be actually very difficult to reverse, even if some core norms like the professionalism of the military you're able to recover, there might be other things that are much more difficult to reverse.
That's a great point.
No, it's an excellent point. I mean, you can argue we had 4 years of Joe Biden, and there really wasn't much to try to proof the presidency, as it were.
I mean, I think the United States is different in a number of ways. First, we have 250 years of the same form of government, basically, which is quite remarkable, the federalism, all that. We have had periods where you've had expansion of executive power, and it got rolled back by Congress. Think about the period immediately after the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. The War Powers Act actually, in some way, shutting down the war, which is Congress did. The way intelligence agencies were reined in, some people believe excessively, but that's not the point, after various excesses of the 1960s. So I wouldn't be that pessimistic. I also, though, would say that we have to understand that friction and tension and difficult things at the margins, that is the norm. Edwin Corwin, in a very famous phrase, said the Constitution is an invitation to struggle over foreign policy and national security. And I think that will always be the case. So I think that's just part of the cut and thrust of democratic life. But even when I get gloomy in the short and medium term, I can't be nearly as sunny as Corey is, but I'm close.
I actually think that's a great note to end on, because I believe we've now hit the 1 hour mark. Because there are Fletcher students in the audience, I am obligated to point out there is a reception afterwards where there is free food and drink. But that is true for everyone. But please join me in thanking our esteemed panel.
You did great.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Saskia, you were terrific. Thank you for that.